Yeah. Honorable Speaker, guests from Elcano, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhary, Director General, Institute of Strategic Studies, and Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, Chairman, Institute of Strategic Studies, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our web talk today on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the EU's role as a global actor. Our speaker today is Dr. Charles Powell. Dr. Powell was supposed to be with us here in Islamabad, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, he had to take a rain check. We do expect him to be in Islamabad maybe next year, but he has been gracious enough to join us and give us a talk on the subject I had just mentioned. Dr. Powell is director of the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, Spain. Elcano is a leading international research think tank in Madrid. Dr. Powell is professor of contemporary history as well at CEU, San Pablo University in Madrid. Dr. Powell holds a BA in history and modern languages from Oxford University, where he also obtained his DPhil for a thesis on Spain's transition to democracy. Prior to settling in Spain in 1997, he was a lecturer in history at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, the J.A. Pye Fellow at University College in Oxford, and a junior research fellow at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. He has published 6 books and more than 50 academic articles on Spanish history, politics, and foreign policy, with special emphasis on its European dimension, and he has also lectured in over 45 countries worldwide. He is an officer of the Order of the Star of Italy and a companion of the British Order of St. Michael and St. George. I would now request Dr. Powell for his, before I hand the floor over to Dr. Powell, I would request Director General, Institute of Strategic Studies, Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhary, for his welcome remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Najam, for introducing Dr. Charles Powell. What an impressive curriculum vitae you have, Mr. Powell. We are very pleased to have this association with your institution. And we are also very pleased that you accepted the offer to speak to us on the web-based application. In fact, we all are now discovering that this is probably the new norm, the new normal. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that after COVID is gone, which I do hope after a few months it is behind us, we are not going to give this up because it is really cost effective, it is time effective. And therefore, a combination of what we used to do as well as the technology is probably going to guide us. I just want to say that there is a considerable attention on how the world is changing in terms of the attention that United States had lately paid to Asia through its initially Asia pivot policy and then Indo-Pacific strategy. And we saw that major power competitions is now intensifying. We also see multilateralism on the retreat. We also see a number of other forces at play like nationalism, sentiment against immigration, economic slowdown, and now COVID. But in all this, sometimes people do wonder, where is Europe in all this? Most of us, like me, believe that Europe is a resilient continent, that Europe can never be written off because of its history, because of its technological prowess and intellectual base. And therefore, we believe that it is important that Europe continues to play its role, and it has all the wherewithal to do that. Spain, like the rest of Europe, has also passed through the recent economic slowdown because of the impact of COVID. But we also know that Spain has done well, as indeed many other nations of Europe. We want to learn from you not only with how Spain and Europe are handling the impact of COVID, but also the overall perspective. You can also lay down a little bit, where is Europe in all these geopolitical changes that are happening? And then, of course, we'll be very happy to hear from you on the topic that you have given to us. So with a very warm welcome to you, the floor is yours, Dr. Powell.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be taking part in this event, and I'm obviously very sad that I can't be with you in person in Islamabad. But let me first of all thank all of you at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad for this kind invitation and for the relationship that we have established over the years. And as you were saying, I very much hope to be with you, not just in spirit, but in the flesh before too long. So yes, basically I just wanted to share some ideas with you about how the EU is responding, but above all, perhaps what the impact of the crisis is likely to be on the EU's role as a global actor. Spain is basically the fourth largest EU member state in terms of its economy and in terms of its population, and therefore is in quite an important, is in a strong position to contribute to this response. But I will basically be talking about the EU dimension and not the Spanish dimension. So let me start with a few preliminary observations. First of all, there's an interesting academic debate and a debate in the think tank community about what the impact of the pandemic will be on the international system. For some people, this is a game changer. Some people are telling us that nothing will ever be the same again. Others, and I think I definitely include myself in this category, basically see the pandemic as a phenomenon which is accelerating and accentuating trends that were already in place. In other words, we are still operating in a multipolar world, which sadly has rather weak and ineffectual multilateral institutions. There is another interesting debate emerging about the impact of the crisis on globalization more generally. And of course, perhaps it's a bit too early to make any definitive assessment, because globalization, of course, is a very complex, multifaceted phenomenon. But and of course, some authors had already detected elements of deglobalization before the pandemic struck, basically as a result of the grand recession that started in 2008. What I would argue is that the nature of the globalization process will change. It will deepen in some areas, for example, perhaps in the area of education as a result of greater digitalization. But at the same time, it will weaken in other areas, for example, as a result of the impact on tourism and travel, but also, for example, as a result of the impact on shorter supply chains. A lot of authors are telling us that we're moving from a just-in-time paradigm to a just-in-case paradigm. In other words, many of these supply chains will suffer the impact of the pandemic, and therefore in the European case, for example, we will perhaps shorten these supply chains and rely more heavily on our immediate North African and Central and East European neighborhoods. So I would argue that the most likely outcome of the pandemic is a more fragmented and regionalized globalization process. And of course, that needn't necessarily be a bad thing from a European perspective, since after all, Europe is based on a philosophy of European integration. Let me also make some preliminary remarks about the EU. Of course, the EU, as you all know, was already experiencing major challenges and difficulties before the pandemic struck. First of all, the EU as a whole was significantly weakened by the 2008 recession, which raised serious doubts about the viability of the euro, the single currency. And in fact, some of our countries, some of our member states were still recovering from that crisis when the pandemic struck. Secondly, as a result of the 2016 refugee crisis, the EU had come under severe domestic internal political stress. This crisis generated an unprecedented wave of xenophobia. The Schengen area, which guarantees the free movement of peoples, had also come under attack as a result of this. Thirdly, of course, the EU has been badly distracted by the never-ending Brexit saga in the wake of the 2006 Brexit referendum in the UK, and inevitably, whether we like it or not, the departure of what was then the third largest economy in the EU was a blow to the EU's credibility and prestige. Though I have to be honest, given the British government's performance since the referendum, frankly, most member states have very few regrets about Brexit at the moment. Fourthly, before the pandemic, we in Europe were already very deeply concerned about the Trump administration's blatant hostility to European integration, both the philosophy of European integration and the reality of European integration. And this is really quite extraordinary, but as you know, the Trump administration actually applauded Brexit and encouraged other member states to follow suit. And this is unprecedented because, of course, originally European integration had occurred under the US umbrella. I think you could argue that European integration, as it emerged in the 1950s, was part of the post-World War II so-called liberal international order. So for Europeans, it really came as a big shock to see a US administration behaving this way. Additionally, of course, there were already, before the pandemic, major concerns about the rise of China. The EU's attitude, I think, was initially perhaps somewhat naive towards China. The EU enthusiastically supported Chinese membership of the WTO in 2001. And in general, the EU was very optimistic initially about the possibility of assimilating China within existing international institutions and structures. 2 decades later, of course, there are very strong misgivings about Chinese intentions, and I will come to this later as well. And finally, of course, in the immediate months preceding the pandemic, there were serious concerns, growing concerns about the impact of growing US-China rivalry. And the fear was that the EU would be condemned to the position of an impotent bystander. And the point I want to stress here is that the EU can only survive and prosper in an open world. It cannot thrive in a world where multilateralism is threatened or in a world where protectionism is rampant. And to some extent, of course, the EU was already swimming against the tide in this sense. It was continuing to sign free trade agreements with Canada, with Japan, with Vietnam, with Singapore, with Mercosur in Latin America most recently, at a time when other parts of the world were clearly moving towards protectionism and a more introspective attitude, if you like. Now, as a result of this, the new European Commission, which took office in December 2019, only a few months before the pandemic struck, announced that it wanted to be a geopolitical commission. And similarly, the Spaniard, Josep Borrell, who is currently the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and also Vice President of the Commission in the EU, declared during the hearings prior to his appointment that the EU should learn to speak the language of power. In other words, before the pandemic, the EU was already beginning to acknowledge that we live in a world dominated by great power competition and rivalry, and that we needed to behave accordingly. Now, let me just point out something that often goes unnoticed outside the EU, and that is that this willingness or this desire to act more geostrategically it raises a number of questions for the EU. First of all, philosophical questions, because of course many within the EU still see this organization as a normative power, to use Ian Manners' expression. In other words, many Europeanists believe that actually the EU was created to reject the notion of hard power, to reject the idea that superpower rivalry is inevitable. And certainly a lot of proponents of the European ideal do not think that the EU should be competing and trying to behave like yet another superpower. Secondly, of course, it raised political problems. The EU is made up of 27 member states with very different histories and very different threat perceptions. And of course, the 27 member states do not share a common perception of other powers. For example, the Baltic states or Poland are obsessed with Russian revisionism. But here in Spain, for example, that is just not an issue. Here in Spain, our main concern is our southern neighborhood. Of course, Africa is only 16 miles away from the southernmost tip of the Iberian Peninsula. So the point I want to make is that although the EU's motto is united in diversity, even before the pandemic, we were often seeing more diversity than unity. Thirdly, there is an instrumental challenge here. How far will the European Union take its aspiration to greater strategic autonomy? Now, this concept of strategic autonomy formally became EU policy when the EU adopted a new global strategy back in June 2016. And ever since then, we've been debating what this strategic autonomy actually means in practice. One definition is that it basically refers to the ability, I'm quoting literally here from an EU document, the ability to set priorities and make decisions in matters of foreign policy and security, together with the institutional, political, and material wherewithal to carry these through in cooperation with third parties, or if need be, alone. And this is the crucial sentence, if need be, alone. In other words, we should have the instruments and the capabilities to act alone on the world stage without the United States. So on paper, this may sound uncontroversial, but of course it's quite hard to implement. Many of our member states basically think that defense is something that Europeans should still leave to NATO. And therefore that the EU should only be active in out-of-area security, dealing with out-of-area security issues, for example, in the Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa. Others, of course, would actually like to see the EU begin to play a more active role in the field of defense. And for the first time in recent years, the Commission is actually funding the European industrial defense industry, for example. So there's a very interesting and lively debate about this. And finally, of course, there is a financial dimension to this. Are EU member states really willing to increase their defense expenditure in order to implement this strategic autonomy? Let me remind you that most European countries have not met NATO's goal, according to which they should be spending 2% of GDP on defense by the year 2025. So let me move quickly now to the impact of the pandemic. And as I was saying earlier, I don't really see it as a game changer. I see it as an accelerator of trends that were already in place. Admittedly, it is a major challenge, though. Not an existential challenge, but it is a very serious challenge. We are going to witness the sharpest decline in economic activity since World War II. According to EU official figures, the European economy will contract by 8.7% of GDP during this year. Hopefully, the economy will rebound in 2021, but of course, we still don't know how the pandemic will behave in the autumn. If there is a second wave, of course, these assumptions would have to be revisited. The impact, and this is also important, of the crisis is not even. It's going to be asymmetrical. So for example, the German economy will shrink by 6%, but the French, Italian, and Spanish economies will shrink by as much as 11%. And this obviously means that different countries see the crisis in rather different ways. Now, as you probably know, there is going to be a European Council meeting on Friday of this week, which will be crucial because at this meeting, member states will have to decide on two things. First of all, they will have to decide on the future European budget for the years 2021 to 27. And basically the figure that's being handled here is 1.07 trillion euros. And at the same time, they will have to decide on a 750 billion euro new generation EU recovery plan, as it's known. So we have the budget on the one hand and a recovery plan on the other hand. Now, the 750 billion recovery plan is crucial to the European Union's future. This is basically 500 billion in grants and 250 billion in loans. The outcome of this summit on Friday is uncertain because there are some so-called frugal states, basically the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Austria, who want to limit the size of the grants and increase the size of the loans. And of course, they also want to make conditionality more stringent. In other words, they want states to have the final say on how this money is spent. So this is going to be a very difficult summit for Europe. But it's crucial for the simple reason that the EU's ability to play a credible role as a global actor will largely depend on its economic recovery. I think it goes without saying that if the EU doesn't bounce back economically next year, other players will conclude that it is in terminal decline and increasingly or in danger of becoming irrelevant. Let me make a few quick remarks about the external impact of the pandemic on the EU itself. As I was saying, the general thesis here is that it has accentuated existing trends. And I would add to that, it is also leading to growing demands for what I've already described as strategic autonomy. First of all, the pandemic has seriously undermined the US's reputation in Europe. A poll was recently published by the European think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations. And according to this poll, only 1% of Germans, Frenchmen, and Spaniards identify the US as their country's most important ally during the crisis, only 1%. Furthermore, 68% of the French people polled and 65% of the Germans say that their view of the United States has actually worsened during the pandemic. In particular, of course, many Europeans were deeply shocked by US hostility towards the World Health Organization at the height of the crisis, and of course its threat, which it has carried out, to withdraw financial support for the WHO. At the same time, of course, the US's inability to handle its own health crisis has undermined European faith in US institutions and perhaps in the US's ability to cooperate with Europe more generally. Secondly, and this is also important, of course, the crisis has also undermined the reputation of China in the eyes of Europeans, though slightly less so. I think it's fair to conclude that this so-called Chinese mask diplomacy has failed. So according to this poll, for example, admittedly, a higher proportion, 4% of Germans and 4% of the French and 2% of Germans say that China was their most important ally during the crisis. But 62% of the French and 48% of the Germans say that their view of China has worsened. At the risk of generalizing, I think Europeans have been shocked by Chinese aggressiveness, bullying, and disinformation campaigns, which, by the way, we find increasingly reminiscent of Russia's disinformation campaigns. And this is a novelty. And of course, this has been aggravated by recent legislation on Hong Kong and aggressive Chinese attitudes towards Taiwan. In other words, I would argue that increasingly European Union elites and the public opinions of our member states are concluding, first of all, that the US is unreliable. Trump has used the pandemic to undermine multilateral institutions, which Europeans strongly support, and exacerbate tensions with China. But at the same time, China would appear to be showing its true colors, so to speak, and the consensus, the emerging consensus, is that it is not a trustworthy ally. There was an EU-China summit in June, which ended without a joint declaration. The EU is currently negotiating a comprehensive agreement on investment. It's been negotiating for 6 years, and the future of this agreement is slightly up in the air. Talks due to be held this month in July will be decisive. And in fact, the EU has recently warned China that it is preparing new instruments to restrict Chinese investment in the EU unless China agrees to a more level playing field in trade. And there is actually quite significant, I think, evidence of a tougher EU stance on China emerging in the last few months. Member states are increasingly hostile to Huawei, the use of Huawei technology in 5G networks. Poland and the Czech Republic, for example, have both announced that they will not be using it. Of course, the question here is whether our so-called European champions, Ericsson and Nokia, can actually offer an economically attractive and viable alternative. As early as Monday of this week, the High Representative, Borrell, warned that Chinese legislation on Hong Kong will affect relations with China, and the EU is in fact currently contemplating export bans on sensitive technologies used by Chinese law enforcement agencies. One big question, of course, is how far will Germany be willing to go? As you all know, China is a crucial trading partner for Germany. However, there could be a possible silver lining in this, because the more its relationship with the US deteriorates, the more seriously China will take the EU. The point I want to make, though, the really important point, is that the EU has been and will continue to be very reluctant to take sides in the US-China conflict. It will obviously always be closer to the US because we supposedly share values and interests, although, to be honest, the extent to which we actually share values is becoming debatable under the current US administration. But in general, I think two widely shared perceptions in the EU are emerging, partly as a result of the pandemic. The first is that closer European cooperation is the only way to protect member states. This doesn't mean that there's growing demand for a federal Europe. It means that there is growing demand for effective cooperation. And secondly, the other, I think, assumption is that growing US-China rivalry and the overall uncertainty at the global level means that the EU needs to strengthen, as I said earlier, its strategic autonomy, and that it cannot rely on global multilateral institutions alone. Now, originally, this concept of strategic autonomy was basically limited to the sphere of defense and security, but what's interesting is that the pandemic has broadened this interpretation. Europeans have woken up to their vulnerabilities, and they now realize that they need more technological, scientific, and digital autonomy. In fact, they even need more agricultural and industrial autonomy in order to guarantee that they are able to produce basic goods. And I think this is actually, again, another silver lining in that potentially it could lead to revival of the European project. And finally, let me turn to the EU's presence in other regions. Now, inevitably and regrettably, the EU's current difficulties have probably undermined its standing, both in its immediate neighborhood and beyond. As far as the immediate southern neighborhood is concerned, the pandemic is having a massive impact in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region. We initially hoped that because the African population is significantly younger, the average age of the African population is in fact 19, the pandemic would not have such a brutal impact, but well, the jury is still out on this, but there are certainly reasons to fear that it will. However, as I said at the beginning, the North African countries may benefit from the reshoring and the shorter supply chains that may result from this in, for example, agro-industry or the automobile sector or the manufacturing sector generally. The danger, I suppose, is that the EU's prestige and credibility may be undermined in Latin America and Africa more generally. And of course, China will probably try to take advantage of this. Of course, due to the pandemic, there will be fewer EU resources available to assist developing nations, although the EU is going to try to make an effort to limit the impact of the pandemic on its development aid. And of course, it will also limit its ability to assist middle-income countries, for example, most of Latin America, a region that Spain, as you know, pays particular attention to. So to conclude, I think one could say, first of all, that the pandemic has accelerated and aggravated global trends which were already visible. The EU's top priority in the near future, understandably, will be its own economic recovery. And of course, it will be several years before its economy is fully restored to pre-pandemic levels. Inevitably, this means the EU will be a somewhat less proactive global actor, at least in the short term. The outcome of November's US presidential election will, of course, be crucial because it will determine the future of the transatlantic relationship. However, even if Biden wins, the US-China rivalry, of course, will continue to exist because it is now systemic, it is structural. And consequently, regardless of the outcome, the EU will probably continue to try to increase this strategic autonomy that I've been talking about. Now, there may be some positive outcomes or consequences to this. I think strategic autonomy inevitably leads to greater political autonomy, and this, I think, could make the EU a more attractive partner in the eyes of the so-called global South. Not least because the EU will be less closely associated with the United States than it has been in the past. And finally, the pandemic, of course, has reminded us all that addressing major transnational challenges, whether in regard to climate change, demography, technology, all of these phenomena require more international cooperation, norms, rules, and institutions, and not less. And because of its founding philosophy and raison d'etre, the EU will remain committed to furthering this multilateral agenda. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell, for that very comprehensive presentation on pandemic and the EU's role as a global actor. Your presentation has flooded me with a lot of questions here. I don't know whether we'll be able to handle all of them, but the first to go would be Ambassador Azazan Chaudhry, Director General, Institute of Strategic Study. Sir, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I agree with Najm that the talk was very clear, concise, to the point, and I think that speaks of the experience that you have, Dr. Powell, and the command that you have on reducing very complex issues to understandable levels. I have three observations, if you allow me to make them. I did note that you said that EU's attitude initially towards China was rather naive, and you thought that it would be possible to assimilate China into multilateral frameworks. But now there are misgivings which are taking place. I wanted to ask you, with specific reference to BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, in which many of the European nations are already engaged and want to participate, whether this connectivity through BRI between China and Eurasian landmass is still relevant or not for the future. This is the first one. The second one is about the NATO. Yes, we have seen a growing calls by the Trump administration that the Europeans should pick up greater share of the defense of Europe, up to 2% of GDP by 2025. But I want to understand what exactly is now the rationale that you understand for NATO's existence? Is it still to address a potential possible threat from a revisionist Russia or resurgent Russia under Putin, or something else we would like to understand better as to what exactly now NATO wants to do? My third observation and question is, how is Europe looking at South Asia? In South Asia, we see that Pakistan is standing at the crossroads of the major power competition. We have outstanding relationship with China, but we have also had good relationship with United States. So we are walking a very balanced line. But something else is also happening in South Asia, where United States has built up India as a possible counterweight to China. And in the process, the Modi administration within India, it has embarked on two course of actions. One, it wants to create a Hindu Rashtra or Hindu state. So kind of nationalism, which has little space for minorities. Europe has seen of that long time ago. And the second, India's relationship with neighbors is now coming in the confrontational mode. Recently, they were having trouble with China, but also previously with Pakistan, and even with Nepal. So, how is Europe looking at South Asia in the light of the changing dynamics, particularly the US-China competition? So, these are the three questions and observations for your submission.
Well, thank you so much. Those are extremely interesting and complex issues. Thank you for raising them. First of all, about China. You're absolutely right. What I meant was that Europeans now, for example, the High Representative in a number of interviews are openly stating that they were naive in their approach to China. And their perception now, for example, is that China is not really playing by the rules in the WTO. The fact that China, as you know, is still formally described as a developing country, which is a slightly absurd notion in some ways, also means that Europeans believe that they were naive in assuming that by inviting China into our multilateral institutions, existing multilateral institutions, this would gradually lead to greater convergence in practices, in behavior, and ultimately perhaps in values. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative has always been quite controversial here. China took advantage of the difficulties that some European states went through as a result of the Great Recession. I'm thinking in particular of Greece, for example. As you all know, China acquired a significant interest in the port of Piraeus in the Aegean Sea. And many EU member states remained quite dubious about the Belt and Road Initiative out of concern for the geopolitical agenda that inspired it. Spain, for example, is one of the EU member states which did not buy into the Belt and Road Initiative at all, and perhaps can therefore act with greater independence, if you like. So my prediction is that the Belt and Road Initiative, although I've seen that in some Japanese texts, they speak as though nothing had happened, and I'd like to, by the way, strongly recommend an article that I read very recently by an influential Chinese author who basically argues that the Belt and Road Initiative is still, Chinese policy. I can't find the reference now. I'll try and pick it up later. So from what we see, Chinese officials are continuing to speak as though the Belt and Road Initiative had been unaffected by the pandemic, but I would argue that it has been very seriously undermined in the eyes of Europeans at least. As I was saying earlier, the mask diplomacy has not been very subtle, frankly. We've seen Chinese diplomats tweeting and speaking in a manner in which they had never done so before. Again, as I said, rather reminiscent of certain Russian government officials. And in China, there seems to be this euphoria generated by the difficulties, the problems that the US and Europe have had in dealing with the pandemic. So many Chinese officials clearly see themselves as winners in this crisis. But the kind of rhetoric that is coming out of China, I think, is rather off-putting and worrying from a European perspective. So I don't think that the Belt and Road Initiative will continue. In fact, of course, it was already in trouble to some extent. The real economic impact of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think you have experience of that yourselves in Pakistan, perhaps was already under debate. About NATO, you're absolutely right, and that is a very important question. What is NATO for in the 21st century in a post-Cold War context? And this is something that we Europeans haven't really faced up to, I think. The reason why we haven't faced up to it is because some European states, the Baltic states and Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, in other words, those who have a border with Russia basically continue to see Russia as an existential threat. And of course, I think this merits a couple of comments about Russia. We often really don't know what's worse, whether a weak Russia or a strong Russia. Because Russia is, I think, systemically quite weak in terms of its economy. It hasn't really been able to diversify its economy. It's still very heavily dependent on its oil and gas exports. At the same time, of course, it's a nuclear power. So as long as this perception of a Russian threat exists, NATO will continue to exist. I think there is no doubt about it. However, many in the EU are not entirely happy with the state of affairs, and that is precisely why there is so much attention now being paid to the European pillar of NATO. Because of course, as you know, most members of NATO, the European members of NATO, are also members of the EU. So in a sense, the main objective is to strengthen European capabilities, regardless of whether we use them for NATO missions or for EU missions, right? And this is something that perhaps the American administration is going to force Europe to do anyway. As you probably know, Washington has announced that it's withdrawing 1/3 of its troops currently deployed in Germany. And this was announced unilaterally without discussing it with the Germans first. So I think, all of this, as I was saying, is going to strengthen the demand for European strategic autonomy. And eventually we won't have a European army as such, but we will have European capabilities, which we will effectively or eventually be able to deploy for territorial defense. So almost regardless, I think, of who wins the presidential election, this is the trend. But of course, in the meantime, it is generating very serious intra-EU tensions, because the threat perception is so different, as I said at the beginning. For Spain, there is no such thing as a Russian threat, or for Portugal, it just doesn't exist. We don't think about Russia in those terms. Russia is not a particularly close economic ally either. The economic footprint is not very large. So to some extent, it's a country one can afford not to think about too much, other than, for example, because of its impact in the Middle East. But obviously for Germany, for Poland, for Hungary, for the Czech Republic, the Baltics, etc., that is a very different story. And finally, South Asia. First of all, I think that as a result of the clash on the Indian-Chinese border, India will probably be seeking a closer relationship with the EU and the US. At the same time, though, there is not much enthusiasm in the EU for this revival of Hindu or Modi-style nationalism. We have the 15th India-EU summit coming up, in fact, right now in July. But there is very little appetite, I think, for a closer relationship. It's true that in the EU, we sometimes talk about the need to strengthen ties between so-called like-minded democracies, which is, I suppose, to some extent, a way of reminding ourselves in the EU that we have often been rather Eurocentric in our view of the world. We have underestimated the importance, for example, of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, and other potential allies. Of course, the problem is that we shouldn't see this exclusively in terms of containment of China. And India is sometimes mentioned in this context, but I really don't see that there is much scope for a deepening of EU-China relations. And of course, as far as Pakistan is concerned, well, as you know, we have what I think is an interesting and so far very successful generalized system of preferences, which was implemented in 2014 and renewed in February of this year, if I'm not mistaken, and which has been extended until 2022. So I think the EU, is fully aware of Pakistan's importance in the region, and as I said, it is wary of putting all of its eggs in the basket of closer bilateral relations with India. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. I have a number of questions, Dr. Powell, which I will be putting up to you on behalf of the participants.
Thank you.
Number one on my list is, how are the other EU members viewing the French President Macron's overture towards Russia, especially in the light of the Bregan-Con, if I've pronounced it correctly, Bregan-Con program, in which the French president is aspiring to, and I quote, build a new architecture of trust and security in Europe, one that includes Moscow. Your views?
Thank you very much. President Macron is, as you know, an extremely ambitious and creative politician. But sadly, he has failed to persuade fellow EU leaders of the benefits of many of the initiatives that he has been advocating, and this is definitely one of them. This really hasn't gained any significant traction whatsoever. This is a very Gaullist approach, if you think about it. It's very reminiscent of General de Gaulle's views about the Soviet Union, in fact, during the Cold War. The idea that the EU or Europe should keep the United States at arm's length to some extent, and that it should engage constructively with the Soviet Union. That, of course, didn't get very far during the Cold War. And in the post-Cold War period, I suppose there was a window of opportunity for this kind of thinking under President Gorbachev, for example, before his dismissal or the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But nowadays, I think this kind of grand French strategy has very little traction in the EU. Essentially, as I mentioned earlier, because Putin's Russia is perceived by many in Europe as an institutionalized authoritarian system. As you know, Putin has recently modified the Russian constitution in order to perpetuate himself in power until the 2032, I believe, which is really quite extraordinary. So we now have the system of authoritarian alternation in office, which basically enables Putin to control the system. This, of course, is not making him very popular in most European capitals. Admittedly, though, there are many people in Europe, in Germany, for example, who believe that we have to move away from the kind of confrontational situation in which we now find ourselves and try to move towards a more constructive relationship. France and Germany are amenable to that. France much more so than Germany, of course. But as I said earlier, pressure from Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltics, I think will largely prevent that from happening. Italy, for example, is also quite in favor of closer ties with Russia. It has strong economic ties with Russia. So Italy is perhaps one of the few countries which greeted Macron's proposal with a modicum, at least, of interest. But as I say, that's not going to go very far. And of course, Macron is very weak at home. The problem is that you have to be strong at home in order to be credible abroad. And the only person who is strong at home and credible abroad in the EU is basically Angela Merkel.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. There is another question, a little observation, and then a question. It says, it is obvious that the EU, on many accounts, is well poised for pushing reforms for regional and global cooperation. But for that to accomplish, it will need to put its house in order. The question here is, what socio-economic and geopolitical changes the EU needs to bring in its own modus operandi?
Well, that's a very good question and a very difficult one. But I certainly agree with the fundamental premise that we have to get our house in order. And that's why I stressed the importance of Friday's meeting, the importance of approving an ambitious budget for the years 2021 to 27, and above all, a recovery plan which really needs to kick in the autumn, if possible, or in early 2021 at the very latest. Because without this, much of this conversation would be a waste of time. The EU would be so self-absorbed that it really wouldn't be able to play a significant international role. So what kind of world does the EU want? Well, the EU, as you know, is very, very strongly multilateralist. And this takes me back to what I said earlier about the EU's self-perception as a normative power. The EU believes in what it used to call effective multilateralism. We don't use that expression so much nowadays. That was part of the previous European global strategy, the first European global strategy approved under Javier Solana's mandate. But that remains fundamentally true and unchanged. In other words, I think multipolarity is a fact of international life, and the EU has to live with that. The EU does not want a G2 world. It wants a world in which multilateral institutions are inclusive and are effective. Now, of course, the main obstacle to achieving that right now is growing US-China rivalry. There is no doubt about that. Consequently, the EU is trying to convince both the US and China to tone down, to reduce this level of confrontation, not least, of course, because the commercial component of this and the technological component of this will inevitably have a negative impact on the EU's economies. So the 10 million billion trillion dollar question is, can the EU cajole, induce, encourage the US on the one hand and China on the other to move away from their current confrontation, or at least to reduce its intensity, and to participate actively in a multilateral system, which, as I said, is the European ideal? Well, to be honest, the prospects are not very good at the moment. I think we can all agree on that. First of all, because of who the occupant of the Oval Office is, and secondly, because of, I think, growing Chinese assertiveness, perhaps even aggressiveness in some respects. This doesn't mean that there is no hope on the horizon at all. Even though I qualified the possible impact of a Joe Biden victory, I think Biden is much more committed to multilateral institutions than President Trump. It's not difficult, I admit. And although Biden obviously wouldn't be able to dial back to, the kind of American approach that we perhaps would have favored, it would be a significant improvement. And the Chinese, I think, also have a vested interest in an order which is predictable and stable. I think it makes sense to make this distinction. You know, the Chinese, in order to prosper economically and in order to guarantee their internal social stability and cohesion, benefit from a global order which is rules-based, predictable, and stable. The Russians, on the other hand, I think, are disruptive by nature right now. So they actually benefit from the absence of order. They, I think, benefit from chaos and confrontation because of their weaknesses, ultimately. So I think there are elements in this scenario which might lead to a partial rebirth of some kind of multilateral order in the not too distant future. Let's be optimistic about this.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. There is another question flowing out from your comments just now, and it is, how will Europe navigate the strategic rivalry between the two global giants, China and the US? And linked to this, is EU ready for the big shifts in its strategic alliances and relations? If yes, to what extent?
Thank you. Well, that really is probably the trickiest question facing EU policymakers. As I said at the beginning, the EU doesn't really want to have to choose. But of course, the problem is that other actors do. The US, of course, as you know, is applying enormous pressure on European governments, for example, to exclude Huawei from our 5G technology. Britain has now done so quite spectacularly. Of course, the UK is no longer in the EU, but in technological terms, you know, what the UK does still matter in the EU. And it's not just Poland and the Czech Republic. Other European countries will obviously follow that road. So in that sense, we are already deciding, right? We are already taking sides. But of course, G5 isn't the whole story. It's only part of the story. So my answer is basically, again, strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy basically means that the EU should be in a position to do things beyond its borders, even if the US doesn't want to join, and even, I would argue to some extent, even if the US opposes them, okay? We aren't there yet, but that is the road, I think, along which we are progressing. Of course, again, as I said earlier, the problem is the internal cohesion of the EU. We are not a federal state. We are a union of 27 sovereign states with different histories and different threat perceptions. And the biggest challenge for this commission and for Angela Merkel, who is the current president of the rotating presidency of the EU, is how to move the 27 along without leaving anyone behind, and in a manner which is fundamentally acceptable to all of them. So to be honest, in the last few years, we have been trying to dodge this bullet, dodge this question. Do we take sides? How do we take sides? But in a sense, both China and the US are making it increasingly easy for us to choose our own path. We're not going to embrace the US fully. We're not going to, obviously not going to embrace China in any significant way because of our political and social models, which are so different. We're going to do it, it's a sort of the Frank Sinatra model. This is, I'm going to do it my way, right? Now, obviously, the big question here, as I've said earlier, is what is the cost of that? Are member states fully aware of the consequences of doing it their way, of going it alone to some extent? I'm not suggesting that NATO is going to collapse anytime soon for the reasons that I discussed already. So even if the trick here will be to design a European path, a European alternative, which is still compatible in some areas with a relatively close collaboration with the United States, but also with significant autonomy. by the way, nobody hardly ever talks about this, but for example, as you know, we have a member state which has nuclear weapons, France. Are we anywhere near a situation in which France would place its nuclear weapons under EU authority? The day that happens, you will know that European strategic autonomy really has teeth. We're still quite a long way away from that, though.
Thank you. I have so many questions here, Dr. Powell, but for want of time, these will be the last two ones for you.
Thank you.
This is, currently the EU is squeezed between the rising tide of nationalism in Europe and looming challenges to global cooperation. How will EU balance between these two specters of instability to continue its role as a global actor?
Thank you very much. Well, it's true that, it's true that we do face the rise of xenophobic, non-inclusive nationalism in Europe. But I have to say that one of the few good things to come out of the pandemic is that there hasn't really been this kind of nationalist backlash. It's true that, in the early weeks of the pandemic, some member states closed their borders without waiting for the European Union to have a say in the matter. And this caused disruption and ill feeling. But overall, I think, at least my impression is that, the pandemic, as I said earlier, has awakened people to the extent of our vulnerabilities and to the fact that only cooperation within the EU and beyond the EU can really provide a way out of these vulnerabilities. So in a sense, although populism, both on the extreme left and on the extreme right, particularly on the extreme right, remains a major problem, and to some extent, of course, will determine the outcome of Friday's European Council, because in countries like Holland, there is a sort of right-wing nationalist populist movement, which is very wary of European integration and very skeptical of the need to assist fellow member states currently experiencing major difficulties. So populism hasn't gone away because of the pandemic. This is a frozen conflict, if you like, or a frozen problem. But the point I'd really like to stress is this: the liberal international order begins at home. In other words, if we aren't capable of putting our domestic houses in order, and that means fighting inequality, for example, growing social inequality, which is one of the worst consequences of the pandemic. I think we should stress this. The pandemic has led to greater inequality within our societies and greater inequality between our societies. So if the European member states do not tackle the challenges of social inequality within their own societies, it is unlikely that the European project as a whole will survive, and even unlikelier that the EU will be able to make a constructive contribution to global governance more generally.
Last question, Dr. Powell. As you're aware that President Trump has recently purchased the entire world stock of key COVID-19 drug remdesivir. Now, Europe is also experimenting on finding a vaccine for the pandemic. The question is, what measure is the EU taking to ensure that when the vaccine is ready, it will be accessible globally rather than to a few Western countries?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me say that one thing that many Europeans didn't actually know before the pandemic is that health is not an EU competence. Health is a national competence, like education. Okay, so the EU didn't really have many powers when it came to dealing with health issues, and this is probably going to change as a result of the pandemic. So again, to look for the silver lining, people are understanding that that security is a very broad concept. It includes health, among other many factors. But there is growing demand, as I said earlier, for cooperation in this field. As you rightly said, a number of EU universities and pharmaceutical companies are currently trying to develop a vaccine. There is already a formal decision at the EU level, which will certainly guarantee that all EU member states have access to this vaccine. And as you probably know, the EU has also agreed to compensate for the WHO's loss of income as a result of America's withdrawal. And one of the reasons why the EU has done this is because it wishes to work very closely with the WHO when it comes to making this vaccine available worldwide. So, I think the EU is very, very aware of the fact that its credibility, its commitment to multilateralism, its commitment to basic fundamental human values, if you like, is under scrutiny, and will therefore do its utmost to ensure that if there is a European vaccine, it will be available to everyone at a reasonable cost.
That's good to know. Dr. Powell, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our interactive discussion. I would now request Chairman BOG, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, for his concluding remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. First of all, I want to convey my very warm greetings to Professor Dr. Charles Powell. This is the first interaction we are having between the Institute of Strategic Studies and Elcano Institute, Royal Institute. And I think this is a very good beginning, and we look forward to many more such occasions in Madrid or in Islamabad. I think you have rightly expressed the wish to visit Pakistan, and it will be our pleasure to host you, I hope not in too distant future. Now, of course, the topic of your lecture was on collaboration, cooperation, how to meet the COVID-19 challenge, and what the European Union has been doing and or will be doing to combat this virus. But I think your lecture has covered, I think, also equally much more important issues also, within which we have to understand what would be the approach of different countries, how to overcome this pandemic. You have made certain points which have added to our knowledge, but which does not sometimes mean that necessarily we fully share your evaluation on all those points. For example, about the BRI and the Chinese initiative, and your perception about China. Mm-hmm. Because you said that China does not play by the rules. On the other hand, you also said that China will benefit from observance of these rules, though. So it is in their interest, and this is what they are using. And this is, in fact, if you see the developments in the world, it is China which is now emphasizing that we should go by the rules, adhere to the rules. And it is the United States which is trying to avoid, if not completely negate, these rules of the global rules agreed, to regulate different facets of international relations. So I was wondering whether your perception that China does not play by the rules is entirely correct. Who is walking out of the international organizations? It is not China. So who's emphasizing more coexistence, economic development, and not confrontation and big power rivalry? So it is up to the people to judge by themselves. But in my view, I don't think this perception is correct. Now about BRI, BRI, of which CPEC is the one of the flagship project. Of course, some attempts by some lobbies did create some aspersions or doubts on this initiative. But I think we have gone through this process and we've come to the conclusion, at least for Pakistan and CPEC, this is the best thing happening to Pakistan in its quest for economic development. And of course, in such a mega project, there will be some difficulties here and there, but what we have to see is what is the general thrust and how the proof of the taste of the cake is in its eating. So, and we have already overcome our energy, this crunch, and also infrastructure is being built throughout the country. We are entering second stage, industrialization, agriculture, socio-economic, cooperation, people-to-people contact. All these things are moving ahead, and so whatever any kind of hesitation you might have detected is no more there, and the government is fully committed to this project, and it is going ahead now with the speed which can be considered quite satisfactory. About strategic autonomy. This is a good, of course, any country or any group of countries would like to have strategic autonomy as an objective. But what is the actual position? Because I sometimes have been conversing with European ambassadors here and abroad also. They said, we want to have this autonomy, but if the chips are down, we are with the United States. So it means it is not a autonomy, as yet. And the kind of administration we have in the United States also doesn't brook such autonomy, strategic autonomy on the part of Europe. So, but of course, as I said, this is a good objective, and still much needs to be done to arrive at that. About NATO, yes, you have explained the rationale, and I think it is not the use of force, but the capacity of power that is important. And so I do concede that your thinking. About this part of the South Asia, when I heard about you, I was really not very happy, because on the one hand, you said you are against this xenophobic, myopic, and extremist Modi philosophy targeting minorities and all these things. But I think the European governments as such have yet to display a very firm stand on what is at play in India. I mean, it's not a small number we are talking of. More than 200 million people in the Muslims in India, and they are being targeted, they are being lynched, reminiscent of what was happening in Nazi Germany. So I think Europeans should have been the first to openly condemn and take some concrete measures to put a stop to this avalanche, which is developing and might overtake the whole region and rest of the world. And it is not only in India. Just to think of what's happening in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. One report after another, report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, reports by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, this genocide alert. Everyone is pointing out to a situation which is deteriorating very fast with all the veneer of India as the secular, democratic country is gone. So I think the people of Kashmir are also looking towards democratic countries of Europe to come to their help before it is too late. Because it doesn't have only a problem for Kashmiris, it also affects the relations between India and Pakistan. It also affects relations between India and other neighbors. And and you are all aware, India and Pakistan are nuclear powers. So I think one has to nip the evil in the bud and not wait till it is too late. So I think if you carry this feelings which we have in this institute and just ponder over it, we'll be grateful. Now, the subject of your talk was, I think, on COVID, so we're a little bit straight in the wider canvas. I think this is a pandemic which has affected all the world, big and small countries. And smaller countries being more vulnerable, they are affected more. And so far, there's no sign of this pandemic subsiding. In fact, there are warnings that there might be another wave which may be more severe and more deadly, And we have not found any, cure, prevention, or anything like vaccines, So it is a real problem and life problem. And what is needed is more cooperation, more collaboration, and more mutual help. And what we are seeing is that many countries, particularly the major power, thinking entirely differently. Instead of strengthening the existing institutions like WHO, I'm not a votary of WHO as such, but there was an institution, and there is an institution which is charged with this responsibility. So instead of undermining it, we should have been trying to strengthen its capacity and its working. And I think we will collaborate with your institute, and I think all the developed countries have to collaborate and pool their resources and use these institutions to find an effective answer to this pandemic. And I want to avail of this opportunity to thank the European Union for having provided financial assistance to Pakistan to meet its immediate requirements in dealing with this pandemic. And we hope that this collaboration will continue, and not only between governments, but also at our institutional level. So I thank you for sharing your views and also patiently listening to our views. And I think through this way, we will arrive at greater understanding of each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That's very, very interesting. And I'm very grateful to you for sharing those thoughts with me. We Europeans have a tendency to be Eurocentric. I'm the first to acknowledge that. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me, and I'm deeply honored and grateful to you and all of your colleagues for having made this exchange of views possible. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Ladies and gentlemen, and Dr. Powell, on behalf of Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry and Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, thank you very much for that very illuminating talk. We were expecting a cheese pizza, but this was a pizza with everything on it, with extra cheese, of course. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We hope to see you back again. And Dr. Powell, we certainly hope to see you in Islamabad very soon, maybe next year, inshallah. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to thank Mario for bringing this together as well. Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you.